Good evening, or good time, whatever it is for you. Sorry for we have a little bit of noise. So good evening, or whatever time it is that you're watching this. Welcome to another sutta study here at Empty Cloud Monastery. If you're watching this later on, then I hope that you find this helpful. And for anyone joining online, for any of the friends joining in live right now, for the front seat to our discussion, welcome also to you. And also to our live audience who have the real front seat or actually here live. So I'll say hello to a few people joining in. Hello to Lydia, all the way from California, and Maria, I assume from Nova Scotia, Bhūmika and Gregory, and anyone else who's joining in. And so at this time I will, and also to Sean, good evening. And so at this time I will render homage to the Buddha, and then we can go ahead and begin with our sutta discussion for this evening. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ dhammaṃ saṅghaṃ saranam gacchāmi. Yo paticca samuppadam passati so dhammam passati. Yo dhammam passati so paticca samuppadam passati. Okay, so I've just chanted a traditional verse that we chant whenever we're going to be giving a talk on dependent origination. And that's a quote that Venerable Sāriputta attributes to the Buddha. He says, whoever sees dependent origination, dependent arising, sees the Dhamma. And whoever sees the Dhamma sees dependent arising. And so this is today we're going to be talking about dependent arising, which is a profound topic, a deep topic. And famously, there's also another encounter with the Buddha about dependent arising, where his disciple Ananda, his chief attendant in the later years of his life, and Ananda was very wise and very intelligent, and also very learned. So he had learned a lot of Dhamma. And at one point, and it said also that Ananda was a stream enterer until the Buddha passed away, and later on he attained awakening. But he was only a stream enterer for the Buddha's lifetime, it said. I don't know exactly when it is that he was said to have attained that, but in any case, so there's another interaction between the Buddha and his attendant, Ananda. And Ananda comes to the Buddha and he tells the Buddha, he says, it's amazing, Bhante. It's wonderful. He says, Acharyam Bhante, Abhutam Bhante. It's wonderful that this dependent origination is so deep, and it seems so deep. But he says that to him, it appears as clear can be. It appears very clear, like if he sees it as something very clear. And the Buddha says, Mahevang Ananda Vacha. Don't say that, Ananda. Mahevang Ananda. Do not say that. He says, Gambhiro Chayang Ananda Paticca Samupado Gambhira Vabhasocha. He says, Ananda, this dependent arising is deep, and it appears deep. And then he says, Etasananda Dhammasa Ananubodha Apativeda Evamayambaja Tantakulakajata Munja Bhubaja Bhuta Apayang Dugatang Vinibatang Sansarang Nati Vattati. So I think I skipped a little part of it, but what he says there is, he says, it's because, Ananda, that this generation, it's because these people don't understand dependent origination, that they are tangled like a tangled mat of reeds, and they're all kind of caught together like a bunch of grass. And he says it's because they don't understand it that they don't escape the underworld, they don't escape hell, they don't escape the lower realms, and they don't escape samsara. So it is a deep topic, and that's why we are going to be discussing it with caution tonight. But I hope that we can shed some light and help clarify this particular sutta. So I will go ahead and get started right away. So if you'd like, the sutta is in the description. Okay, so let's take a look here. So this is the Bhūmijasutta, and it begins, this is in the Samyutta Nikaya, the chapter on dependent origination. It begins, at Savatthi. Then in the late afternoon, Venerable Bhūmija came out of retreat went to Venerable Sāriputta and exchanged greetings with him. When the greetings and polite conversation were over, he sat down to one side and said to him, so I'll pause here just to give who is our cast. So Venerable Bhūmija is, in this context, he appears to be a Buddhist monk. So we have a Buddhist monk named Bhūmija. And then he is leaving his retreat. So what this means is that he was spending time alone during the day. So in the time of the Buddha, as well as common today, after the meal, the monks would go and spend time alone. And so then around the time, later on, they might come out and have a discussion, or they might meet in the evening sometimes. So he's already been alone, and now he's coming, and he goes to Venerable Sāriputta. And Venerable Sāriputta was the Buddha's foremost bhikkhu disciple in wisdom. So the Buddha said that no one could match Sāriputta at wisdom. At best, someone could match him. I should say no one could excel him. So no one could go beyond. No one could be wiser than Sāriputta. And so Sāriputta is like the Buddha's wisdom side, right? He doesn't have all the Buddha's qualities, but he has the wisdom quality. So Sāriputta was the wisest of the Buddha's disciples. And then the wisest bhikkhuni disciple was Khema. So you have Sāriputta and Khema, who are like a team. So the wisest bhikkhu is Sāriputta, the wisest bhikkhuni is Khema. And so Venerable Sāriputta was a very wise and very helpful monastic for the community. So he, he taught many monastics. And at one point, the Buddha said that Venerable Sāriputta was like a mother, I believe it was. I believe Venerable Sāriputta was like a mother. And if I'm not mistaken, and the Buddha says he's like a mother because he gives birth to people in the Dhamma. So he teaches people the Dhamma so that they can attain stream entry. And then Mahamoggallana was like a nurse. So he brought the babies that had attained stream entry, he brought them up to arhants. So Venerable Sāriputta was famous for his teaching, and teaching specifically the Four Noble Truths, to teach people clearly how to see the Buddha's teachings. So he was very wise and very helpful and very prominent figure. He was one of the leading monastics, you could say, in the Sangha, right, as a teacher. And so it would make sense that Venerable Bhūmija would go up to him to ask him a question as he's about to. So he exchanges polite conversation, and then he sits down. So he's respectful, and then he asks him, he says, Reverend Sāriputta, there are ascetics and Brahmins who teach the efficacy of deeds. Some of them declare that pleasure and pain are made by oneself. Some of them declare that pleasure and pain are made by another. Some of them declare that pleasure and pain are made by both oneself and another. And some of them declare that pleasure and pain arise by chance, so randomly, not made by oneself or another. What does the Buddha say about this? How does he explain it? How should we answer so as to repeat what the Buddha has said and not misrepresent him with an untruth? How should we explain in line with his teaching with no legitimate grounds for rebuttal and criticism? Okay, so this is starting off with a question about, it says, the efficacy of deeds. So in Pali, this is kammavada. So what this means is a doctrine of karma, a doctrine of action. So efficacy of deeds. What it means is that there are people, what Venerable Bhūmija is saying is that there are religious teachers. So ascetics and Brahmins, samanas, are a particular type of religious people who were not part of the Vedic religion. And Brahmins, who are priests, religious figures, part of the Vedic religion, right? So you could maybe vaguely think about this in a kind of European context as like the Brahmins are all the Christians, so like the Christian priests and the Christian monks, and then the ascetics, the samanas, are like everyone else. So you might have, for example, the main religion, and then you have a bunch of other people who practice a different religion. Now, it's different because in ancient India, you didn't have like a religious hierarchy which oppressed other religions. So they were allowed to coexist. So the Brahmins were not like the Christianity of Europe in that sense, but they were a more organized religion, right? So they had priests and they had rituals and they had different kind of, levels of people within that system. So the Brahmins are priests or religious figures within the Vedic system. And then the samanas, the ascetics, as it's translated here, are religious leaders or religious practitioners who practice something else. So, for example, the Buddha was a samana, right? He was not a Brahmin. Well, at least he wasn't a Brahmin in that sense, right? And other times he says that he was a Brahmin, but in a different sense, in a spiritual sense. So he was an ascetic in that he didn't follow the Vedic religion. He taught something else. Also, Jainism. Jainism is an existent religion to this day, which existed at the time of the Buddha, and they are a Shramana or a Samana religion, so not a Brahminical one. So what he's saying is that amongst all these different people, so he's saying, he's not talking about a particular religion. He's just saying that there are many different religious people who teach the efficacy of deeds, right? So there are some who teach the efficacy of deeds, but they teach it in different ways, right? So they teach essentially, what is this efficacy of deeds? They teach that what you do matters, right? As I have heard, I don't speak Thai, but as I've heard in Thailand, they say you do good, you get good, do bad, get bad, right? So that is efficacy of deeds, right? That means that if you do something, there's going to be consequences of that, right? So that's different from like a doctrine of grace, right? Grace says it doesn't matter what you do. If a divine figure gives you a gift, then that's how you get salvation, not because of your own actions. So, for example, some Christian groups, they don't actually believe in the efficacy of deeds, right? They don't say that if you do good, you get good. No, they say everyone, it doesn't deserve heaven, but God gives some people grace by his own choice, not because of what they did. You could never buy your way in, they would say, right? You can't, no matter what you do, it'll never be good enough. It has to come from God. So I'm just pointing that out to show that it's not a universal teaching, right? Some people say, oh, every religion teaches that. Well, actually, no, they don't. Not every religion does teach that. So some do and some don't. And so Bhūmija is saying, okay, there are some who teach this, but even within that idea, right? You do good and you get good, you do bad and you get bad. Still, not everyone teaches it the same way, right? So we can't just stop there. There's also a nuance, and that is some people teach it in different ways. So there's 4 ways. There are 4 ways that you can teach this according to Bhūmija, according to Venerable Bhūmija. He says there are 4 ways, and he's asking which of these 4 is the Buddha teaching, right? How does the Buddha teach this? So what are the 4 options? So we're talking about how pleasure and pain are created. Now, what I'll say at this time is when it says pleasure and pain, what this really means is this is not talking about if you eat an ice cream, it feels pleasurable. Everyone would agree with that, right? That's not a religious doctrine. So everyone agrees, like if you eat something pleasant, it causes pleasure. If you, stab your foot, it's going to be painful. So that's not what he's talking about here. When he says, pleasure and pain arise from this, he's talking about pleasure and pain in the context of karma. That's why, the context of like religious, or I should say ethical, moral choices giving rise to certain experiences. So not like eating ice cream, but like you do an act of generosity and then that causes pleasure to arise. Like maybe you then have a good rebirth, for example, right? Or you do, you're very immoral and then you have a very painful rebirth. So the idea is that, or in one life, you can have different experiences that are due not to your immediate, you could say, they're not directly and solely related to your immediate actions, but they also have a component from ethical choices that you made, right? So I just want to clarify, that's what he's talking about here, right? So he's saying that some say that pleasure and pain arise. They teach a doctrine about karma. They teach that what you do matters, what you do counts, right? You reap what you sow, I should say. And they teach that, and they say that pleasure and pain are made by oneself. So the Pali word is sayankata. So kata means it's made by, or it's done by. So the pleasure and the pain, so all the experiences, like the fruits of your karma, the results of your actions, the consequences of your deeds, right? What the fruit that you sow, so the thing that you get from what you do, they say that comes from, it's made by yourself, right? So you do it, right? And then you get the results. So this is, like I said, you reap what you sow, right? You don't reap what he sows, right? So if your neighbor has a field and they plant apples and you plant pears, what do you get? Do you get apples or do you get pears? You get pears. You don't get apples, right? Or if your neighbor plants mangoes and you plant rice, do you get mangoes or do you get rice? You get rice, right? Because you planted it. So you get what you plant and they get what they plant. So this is the first teaching. This is the first option. Okay. So this is the most common sense one you could say, right? Like when we talk about, what we do counts, it's almost in the name, right? What I do counts. That's implying that it's made by myself. So what I do, that gives rise to the experiences. Okay, that's the first option. The second option, he says that some teach that the results of their actions is parankatang. It's made by someone else. So what this is saying is rather than just someone else, I would rather say it's made by another. So para means something like something else, right? Something not yourself. So the idea here is that in contrast to the first one, which is saying that you do a deed and then you yourself give rise to the results. So like, for example, you could say that, you do a certain deed and then that deed sticks around with you, and then you create it in your future lives, maybe unconsciously, but it's all within yourself. It's a kind of internal process, right? You do certain deeds and then you get the results. So it's a completely internal. The second one, parankatang sukadukang, pleasure and pain, means it comes from someone else. So this would be like God punishes you when you do good and bad, right? So let's say that you do good things. There's the idea that you don't actually cause, the pleasure and the pain you get, it's not from yourself. It's from another being, like God. But God gives it according to what you do, right? So it's not random, but it's like if you do good things, God will reward you. If you do bad things, God will punish you. So some people teach this, is what he's saying. So they still teach that it matters what you do, but it's created from something else. It's not created by yourself, right? The pleasure and the pain are created by an external agent. In the first choice, pleasure and pain are created from an internal agent, like the one who does the action. So apart from God, so just to talk about this, so for example, in ancient India, there were some people who said that it doesn't make sense for there to be karma. It doesn't make sense for actions to have results without some being who gives the results, right? And many people ask this to this day, right? They'll ask, well, if there's karma and the results of karma, who gives the results? Like who decides, where you get reborn? Or who decides that you get to, let's say that someone has some kind of illness as a result of their actions, then someone might say, well, someone had to give them the illness, right? It has to come from somewhere, like a deity, like a god or something. So in ancient India, as well as today, people sometimes think like that, like the results of your actions, the pleasure and the pain, they come from another force externally. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense, is how it goes. That's how people think. So I should say some people. So this is that teaching. In addition to a deity or something, parankatang also means an external force, which is maybe not a deity, but it could be something else. So for example, it could be nature. So also in ancient India, there was a doctrine of basically nature giving you. So it's not like a personal God, but it's like an external kind of destiny, almost like the equivalent to this would be today people say, oh, the universe wanted me to have this. Or, oh, the universe sent me a child. Or like, oh, the universe gave me a new job promotion. So you notice how they're using the word universe as if it was giving, results, as if it was like a God. But because they don't want to say God, maybe because they don't believe in God, or they don't, they find that superstitious. So they say the universe. But they're still saying it's coming from something else, right? Like it didn't come from themselves. So this is that tendency of thinking that maybe you see like someone does something, like there's a criminal and then they get punished and people say, oh, the universe is punishing them, right? So they still have this idea that their actions have results, but they think that it's like an external force which administers those results. In this case, the universe. So nature, the universe, God, maybe many gods, right? Maybe like many different gods. So it can be many different things. But that would be best teaching. Like it's an external being who does it, or an external force who's giving the results. Okay, then the third option is a mixture. So the third option is saying sayankatancha parankatancha. That means both from oneself and from another. So you might think, well, maybe you're listening to this and you think, well, I do think that sometimes it comes from myself, and sometimes I think maybe it comes from the universe. So maybe it's both, like it's a mixture, right? So that would be the third option. And the third option is, for example, the view of the Jains, right? So the Jains are very famous for their what's called anekantavada. That means the doctrine of not having just one side. So the Jains, to this day, they have a form of nonviolence, right? So the Jains are very careful about practicing nonviolence, right? And one aspect of nonviolence in the Jain religion is nonviolence with your ideas, like your ideologies, right? So not getting into arguments and debates. So in Jainism, one simile that's given for this, which is also found in Buddhism, but in a slightly different context, is they say it's like an elephant. So if you have an elephant and a bunch of blind people touching the elephant, so they can't see the elephant, right? But they can feel it and they can hear it. So one person touches the elephant's trunk and they say, oh, elephants are like very thin and long, or they're like a tube. And someone else touches the elephant's body and they say, elephants are big, like really massive and warm. And someone else touches the elephant's horns and they say, no, elephants are really pointy and sharp and hard. And someone else touches the elephant's tail and they say, actually, elephants are very hairy and furry. And someone else touches the elephant's foot and they say, wow, elephants are very big, have very big feet and are very, very powerful, maybe very hard because of their feet, right? So who is right? Right? Are elephants big and soft, or are elephants warm and pointy, or what is it? And the Jains say they're all right? They all touch the same elephant, but they're just coming at it from a different angle. So they say anekantavada, so not one-sided, like it has many different sides to it. There's not just one way that the elephant is, right? So an elephant is many things. It's many ways. Maybe someone else hears it and they say, oh, elephants make, they sound like this. So that is also true, right? So the Jain view is that, well, both can be true, right? So you say it's from yourself, you say it's from someone else. Well, how about we're all right, right? And also there's a third option, which is that it's both of them. So they would say there's actually many sides. Like one side is from your own self, another side is from someone else. So to give an example, specifically in Jainism, they say that, because Jainism also teaches a doctrine of karma, right? They would say that a person who does a deed, when they do an action, their soul, if I'm misrepresenting, I apologize, but this is my kind of rough understanding of the Jain teaching, is that their soul, it almost like vibrates and it picks up, because of their defilement, their kind of attached action, like maybe they do something out of anger. So then their soul will kind of vibrate and it will attract karmic particles, like microscopic dust. It'll attract karmic particles to the soul. And then the karmic particles will stick to the soul, and the karma particles will then cause pleasure and pain according to the nature of the karma. Like it's literally a material kind of thing. So they would say it's both oneself and another, right? So it's both your soul, which is like attacking, which is sticking to the particles and causing the karma to continue and giving rise to the pleasure and pain. So it's actually partially from yourself, but it's also from the particles. It's from nature, because the particles are external things which have their own nature to them. Right? They have particular times when they give the results and so on. So according to the Jain view, it's actually both, right? And you could also see this being another way, like maybe it's from the universe, like I said, and yourself. Or some things are from God and some things are from yourself. So in some Christian teachings, they say that humans have free will and God has free will. So some things that humans experience comes from their own free will, and some things that they experience comes from God's free will. And the reason that they say that is to explain evil, right? Because if God is all loving, then why would he create, cancer? So that many Christians will say, well, humans create cancer because of their sin, but God creates, the cure for cancer or something, right? So very convenient, of course. But not to pick on anybody. This is just the teaching. You can see how it's a mixture, right? So part of it is human, part of it is God. So there might be many motivations to it. Like in the Christian case, it's like a theological motivation, right? You have to explain evil. In the Jain view, it's maybe like a doctrinal reason and also a non-violence reason. So anyway, I'm just explaining why you might see these different views, right? And then the last one is the one I would say makes the least sense in this context, is asayankarang aparankarang adhitya samuppanna sukhadukkha. So that means it's not made by yourself. It's not, the results, they're not given by yourself, and they're not made by someone else. They are random. They are arisen by chance. Now, some people do say this today, right? So if you look at, for example, maybe like a very naive materialist view, right? Like the view that the only thing that exists are atoms and space, right? So nowadays that's really being questioned, but it used to be quite common. And I would say that a lot of people probably hold to that view just because they don't really, they're not themselves scientists, right? So they just kind of assume that that's how the world works. So the view that there's like atoms, which are kind of indestructible billiard balls, and then space, and that's all that exists. So if you ask someone like, well, why is it that way? There is no explanation. It's just random, right? You can give an explanation up to maybe the Big Bang, but you can't give any explanation. It's just random from there. And then everything else is just predetermined billiard balls bouncing around each other in space, right? So you could say that that's kind of a sort of random doctrine. Now, obviously there's problems with that. Like if the only thing that exists are atoms in space, then how do physical laws work? How does gravity exist? Because gravity is not a particle. Right? How does mathematics exist in the universe, right? When you measure the universe, you find mathematical principles to it, and those are not physical. So already, like if anyone believes in physical laws, they believe in more than atoms in space, right? They believe in atoms, space, and non-physical laws, which they don't know how to explain, unless you have a theory for it, in which case then you have to explain that. So, but I would say that that is an example of maybe a kind of random doctrine that exists today, like atoms in space view. And then maybe another random doctrine would be just the idea that it's all random. Maybe you don't have an explanation for it, but it's like, well, someone gets a promotion, and someone is born with an illness, and someone is born in a really wealthy family, and someone's born in heaven, and someone's born in hell, and it's just random. There's no real. They might say that there's no reason, right? Without an explanation. So the reason I say this makes the least sense is because supposedly these people are teaching Kamavada. They're supposedly teaching that actions have results, they have consequences. So it's not clear to me how exactly that would be possible if you think that pleasure and pain are random, right? They wouldn't be random to that extent. They would be conditioned by your actions. So the only way that I would maybe try to make sense of that would be like in the atoms in space model, where all that exists are space and minuscule billiard balls. Then you can maybe say that maybe people hold the view that for some reason that what you do counts, but it's completely random how exactly that works out. It's not from yourself or another thing. It's just completely random. So you could maybe try to work it around there, right? Like it's all random, but somehow there is, an efficacy of what you do. So I'm not 100% sure on how someone would justify to themselves that teaching, but that is also presented. But apart from the doctrine of karma, that is also a teaching, right? So people do say that pleasure and pain are random. So it could also be like an editing error in the sutta, just because it's the same phrase repeated again and again. So these could just be people who teach random pleasure and pain. Okay, so then now we have an explanation. So hopefully that's thorough enough to have an idea of what is being discussed, right? And then he asked, what does the Buddha say about this? How does he explain it? So very wise question, right? So this was a Buddhist monk, and he wants to know, what does the Buddha say? And then he says, how should we answer so as to repeat what the Buddha has said and not misrepresent him with an untruth? So the point he's saying is that someone might ask him, right? Okay, you're a Buddhist. So what does the Buddha say? And then you say, maybe the third one. And then the Buddha says, you foolish man, you empty person, you misrepresented my teaching. So the Buddha did not like people misrepresenting him. Obviously he didn't have aversion, but he disapproved of that because he said it created a lot of suffering for oneself, because you're confusing people. You're teaching people the wrong thing. So it's bad for yourself because you're confused, and it's bad for others because you're teaching them the wrong thing, right? It's like if someone asks for directions, if you give them directions that will get them lost, it's very dangerous. So the Buddha was very, he put a lot of emphasis on, like, especially a Buddhist monk, when they're being asked a question, they should not misrepresent what he said. Because if they misrepresent him, not only do they mess up that person's spiritual journey to that extent, and they have wrong information for their own practice, but also they spread rumors about the Buddha, right? So they're rumors like, oh, the Buddha teaches this. And then it comes back and it causes problems for everyone, because then people criticize the Buddhism. So, like, for example, there was one monk who famously said that enjoying sensual pleasures, he said it wasn't an obstacle to the practice, right? So then other people maybe hear that, and then they hear that, oh, the Buddha's, Buddhists, they just love indulging in sensual pleasures. So then they don't want to practice, and then there's a bad reputation, and then it obstructs many people. So the Buddha was very strict about, no, that's not what he teaches. Sensual pleasures are an obstruction. And so there's actually a rule that if a monk starts teaching that, they have to be corrected. And if they don't stop, then they can be expelled. So it's actually like, there's a rule that, like, you're not allowed to teach that without the community is supposed to correct you. And if they correct you and you still don't listen, then you're expelled. So anyway, so that's what he's saying, right? So he's saying, how can we not misrepresent him? And how should we explain in line with his teaching with no legitimate grounds for rebuttal or criticism? So how can we explain it where the way we explain it will not, there's no grounds for saying, no, that's wrong. That's not right. That's not what the Buddha teaches. Okay, so for any of you who are listening and not cheating, or maybe not cheating, I should say, but not following along, you can guess, right? How does the Buddha explain this? I'll give you about 5 seconds to think it up. How does the Buddha explain, where do pleasure and pain come from? Okay, drum roll. So the Buddha, he says, Venerable Sāriputta says, Reverend, the Buddha said that pleasure and pain are dependently originated. They're paticca samuppannang. They're dependently arisen. So that means that they arise due to particular causes. Just because people hear this word so much, like dependent origination, dependent arising, it almost becomes meaningless. Also, causes and conditions, it almost becomes meaningless because it's just repeated so much. Maybe I like to shake it up sometimes. So another translation of dependently arisen, you could say, is circumstantially arisen. Or you could also say it is conditionally manifested. It appears under certain conditions and not under others. So what does it mean? It means that under certain conditions, there is pleasure and pain. Under other circumstances, there is not pleasure and pain. For example, a rainbow. Under certain conditions, you experience a rainbow. Under other conditions, you don't. So rainbows don't exist in and of themselves, right? They appear under certain conditions, not under others. So it looks like, when you look at a rainbow, it looks like it's just there existing in the sky, right? But actually, colors don't exist in nature. Colors exist within sentient beings. They're produced within a being. That is also, the view of modern science. So not just Buddhism. That is, color doesn't exist in nature. It exists in the way that the mind processes light waves. So light waves don't actually have color. It's something that our mind produces. So rainbows they're not actually out there. It just appears that way. They don't actually, all that is, you could, speaking very kind of roughly, you could say that what is there is maybe like water and light, right, refracting, but even light and so on. So even then it starts we can break it down further, but rainbows don't actually exist in the way that they appear there. They are under certain conditions. Like if you have the external conditions and you have a being who has the ability to see colors, they will see a rainbow. If a dog looks at the same thing, they won't see it, right? Because dogs process color differently from humans. So which one is it? Is there a rainbow or is there not a rainbow? Who's right, the dog or the person? Both are right, right? The dog is right in terms of the conditions at the time for the dog. And the human is right for the human conditions. You can't say like, no, the dog is wrong. There's really a rainbow there. because that's only due to your conditions of having the particular way that your mind and brain process light waves. It's not independent. It's conditionally arisen. It's circumstantial. So rainbows appear under certain circumstances, not under others. Okay, so that's what dependently arisen means. So he says, Sukha-dukkha paticca samuppanang koavaso sukha-dukkhaṃ vuttam bhagavata. So the Blessed One, the Lord, the Buddha says that pleasure and pain are arisen due to particular conditions. They arise dependent on what? King paticca. So, okay, causes and conditions, blah, 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 right? What causes and conditions? So in the suttas, very rarely, in fact, I don't think ever, it's never said like, oh, this appears due to causes and conditions, period. It always says it appears dependent on this. So it's specific thing, like not a general abstract idea like, oh, I don't know, what is it? It's dependent, I don't know what. No, it's always a specific thing. So pleasure and pain are dependently arisen. King paticca, dependent on what? Drum roll. Dependent on contact. Dependent on phassa. Phasam paticca. So they're dependent on contact. If you said this, you would repeat what the Buddha has said and not misrepresent him with an untruth. You would explain in line with his teaching, and there would be no legitimate grounds for rebuttal and criticism. Okay, are we done for the night? So you know how to answer now. If someone asks you, does the Buddha say that pleasure and pain come from yourself or from an external being or from a mixture, or is it random? You say, the Buddha has said that pleasure and pain arise dependent on contact. Okay. But then he continues, so then he gives more explanation. Okay, so we're not satisfied yet. So then he says, Venerable Sāriputta continues. He gives more explanation. He says, consider the ascetics and Brahmins who teach the efficacy of deeds. In the case of those who declare that pleasure and pain are made by oneself, that is conditioned by contact. Okay. In the case of those who declare that pleasure and pain are made by another, that's conditioned by contact. Those who say that pleasure and pain are made by both oneself and another, that's conditioned by contact. Those who say that pleasure and pain arise by chance, not made by oneself or another, that's also conditioned by contact. Okay. Consider the ascetics and Brahmins who teach the efficacy of deeds. In the case of those who declare that pleasure and pain are made by oneself, it's impossible that they will experience that without contact. In the case of those who declare that pleasure and pain are made by another, it's impossible that they will experience that without contact. Those who say it's made by both, it's impossible they will experience that without contact. And those who say it's arisen by chance, it's random, it's impossible they will experience it without contact. Okay, and then that is the end of Venerable Sāriputta's teaching, and then it'll continue later. So, what does this mean? So, Venerable Sāriputta is saying, okay, there's all these different theories. The Buddha says that pleasure and pain are dependent on contact. So, I will explain what contact is in just a moment. And then he says that the Buddha's explanation actually captures all of the previous explanations, and it's implied that it replaces them, like it's better than them, because actually they are building an idea on top of something more basic, right? Okay, so what is contact? So the word is phassa. Phassa, contact in Pali, literally means touching. Like if someone touches you, right? That's contact, like physical contact. So the word in English, contact, comes from tact, which means touch, like tactile, right? Textures and tactile. Tactile means touching. And in Romance languages, the word for touching is related to tact, right? So tact. And con, which means coming together. So it means two things touching one another. Like contact is when two things touch, right? So it's the same meaning in Pali. Pali phassa means touch, and it also means basically when two things join, and then an experience arises depending on that. So, for example, when your eye meets a sight, they touch, they have contact, and then you experience that sight, right? So when someone touches you, you say, ah, you experience it, you feel it. Why? Because their body came into contact with your body. So contact is when one of our senses, our eyes, our ears, our nose, our tongue, our body, or our mind, when one of our senses contacts, when it touches something, some experience, right? So our eyes see things like a rainbow, our mouth feels food, our body feels sensations and clothing and so on, and our nose smells, right, odors, our ears hear noises and so on. So that is whenever we have an experience, there's contact there, right? So what does that mean, right? Well, that means that when you experience pleasure or pain, it arises dependent on contact, right? So that is what the Buddha is saying. So in dependent origination, which has many different facets, right? Many different ways of teaching it. It's not just one thing. Dependent origination just means when things arise independent on something. But in the very famous list of 12 conditions, which explains how the process of samsara continues, then you have phassa paccaya vedana. Contact is a condition for feeling, vedana. So phassa paccaya vedana. This is the exact same teaching here. Sukha dukkha is vedana, it's feeling, it's sensation, it's experience, it's a pleasure, pain experience. So vedana are our experiences, our sensations and our feelings. It's the thing, it's when we feel the world. Like if someone slaps you across the face, how do you know? You feel it, right? How do you know you're breathing? Because you can feel it. So that is vedana. It's that aspect of like lived feeling, that feeling thing where you have a sensation. So that arises when your senses contact the world, right? So when your senses contact the world, when there's contact, then there's a feeling of pleasure, of pain, or a neutral. So maybe your tongue contacts ice cream and it feels tasty. Or your tongue contacts ice cream. I should say your eyes contact ice cream. And then your mind contacts the idea of ice cream and it thinks, tasty. And then your tongue contacts ice cream and it thinks, ouch, because it was so cold. It was expecting it to be tasty. So, right, there's many different sensations going on there. There's a mind sensation, like the idea of ice cream. There's the eyes, which are experiencing just like a neutral sensation, maybe of the ice cream itself. And then there's the tongue experiencing the painful sensation of the cold ice cream. Right? Or maybe a child has ice cream, or also adults, and then they have brain freeze, right? So that would actually be body, not mind in Buddhism. Brain freeze is a physical sensation. So that's contact. I hope it's clear. So we experience different sensations depending on contact. And you might be thinking, well, that's obvious, right? That's obvious. It doesn't actually answer the question. But that's precisely the point, is that these ways of answering the question, they're going too far. So that's why Venerable Sāriputta, then he says, those who say it's made by oneself, that's also conditioned by contact. So like, let's say someone says, oh yes, this is because of this result of my actions is from myself. Well, that is an experience that they're having dependent on their senses. Someone else says, oh, it's from God. Well, that is an experience that they're having dependent on their senses. You see, it levels out. Like, independent of what your theory about it is, both boil down at the root. They're just sensory experiences. And they arise due to certain conditions, namely having senses and then having the appropriate external conditions, like the rainbow, right? So you say the rainbow comes from God, the rainbow comes from my mind, the rainbow comes from a mixture of both. And the answer is it comes from contact. No matter what the explanation is, it comes from contact, certain conditions with your senses in the world, right? Okay, so then that's why Venerable Sāriputta is saying, independent of the theory, they all fold back into contact. Then he says, consider those who say it's made by oneself, pleasure and pain. It's impossible that they will experience that without contact, right? So say that someone gets cancer and they say, this is my karma. I got this because of what I did, and I have created this result for myself. it's impossible you would experience that if you didn't have sensory organs experiencing the world. Even your theory, even the ideas in your mind are sensory experiences. Now, someone else gets the exact same thing. They also get cancer, and they say, this is from God. Well, also for them, their cancer is dependent on sensory experiences, right? It's dependent on them having senses, and so it's also dependent on contact. So whether or not, like, whatever you think about where it came from, it has to come from one place for sure, and that's contact. So it's kind of like the root, and out of the root grows many different flowers. But if you cut the root, you cut all the flowers, right? All the flowers will die. So the root is the common source of all the flowers on the surface. So contact, no matter what your theory of the experiences that you're having in the world are, the Buddha said the answer that would be in line with what the Buddha taught is it comes from contact. That's why it comes from. So you say, well, how do I get rid of that? Well, that would be another story for another day, right? But you would have to end ignorance so that you don't get reborn with more senses. You'd have to stop getting reborn again, right? So it's too late this life, right? It's too late not to experience contact. So contact, pleasure, and pain also are irreversible, right? So you might think, oh, for example, I've actually heard some people feeling like, for example, there are stories of certain arahants being abused, right? Like there's a story of Angulimala getting rocks chucked at him and so on from the villagers because they knew in the past he was a murderer, right? And some people perceive that as like a negative thing. Like Angulimala must not have been as high of a spiritual person, right? But actually, it's impossible. Any person, whether even the Buddha was criticized, even the Buddha had rocks thrown at him by his cousin Devadatta. So it doesn't matter. Even if you're the Buddha, you will experience pleasure and pain. Even the Buddha was assaulted, right? He was assaulted by his cousin of all people. So it doesn't matter how spiritual, how advanced you are. You will experience pleasure and pain if you have senses, right? So if you have senses which contact the world. And so in order to end that, you would have to end your senses, which is not, that cannot be ended by, dying. That's not the end. That's like the flowers. There's actually a deeper root. The senses grow from our craving. So anyway, that's a story for another time. So what happens next? Venerable Ananda heard this discussion between Venerable Sāriputta and Venerable Bhūmija. Remember Venerable Ananda? The one who was very learned and who knew about dependent origination. So he was listening in. So he was listening to the Dhamma. And then he heard this. And then he went to the Buddha. He bowed to the Buddha, sat down to one side, and informed the Buddha of all they had discussed. Okay, at this point, I'm actually going to pause. I'm just going to check if we have any questions which are best answered now. Okay, I think we'll... Actually, yes, I'll answer these now just because since we're on this topic. Okay. Okay, so we have a question from Lydia, just because I'm not sure how far we'll get. So Lydia says, is karma a natural law? Maybe the idea of pain is from the universe, meaning a natural law. So sometimes karma is called a natural law, but you can see here, what is the Buddha's answer, right? Does it come from oneself, from another? So you could say karma is a natural law, but I'm a little bit, it's sometimes I use that explanation and sometimes other monastics use that explanation. So like I wouldn't, if someone says it, I wouldn't say it's wrong. But I would say that we have to be careful with that analogy. Because when we talk about natural laws, what we're really talking about is often we're comparing it to like a physical law. And when we think about karma like that, I would say it's a little bit off. Like if you think that the universe has the law of karma baked into it, right? It's like an external thing. That would be a little bit, I would say, questionable. That'd be a little bit off. So it can be explained in that way, but it's not, I wouldn't say it's the most precise. It's not like it's more related to also, it's not like gravity, right? So in the sense that gravity is like a physical external law, which operates on physical objects. karma is a little bit different than that. It's not like some kind of force like gravity which operates on physical objects. That would be a bit too naive of a view, I would say. But you could say it's a natural law in the sense that it is a law of life. It's a law of nature in the sense of existence, like just your life. It's a law that, yes, if you do good, you're going to experience good results. You're creating the fruit, good results for the future. So it's a law in that sense. But in the physical law sense, I think we have to be careful, because sometimes we draw that analogy too far and we compare it to like a physical force. Okay. And then Sut says, how should one view pleasant and unpleasant sensations and contacts? Let's say you are hearing unpleasant words thrown at you. How would the Buddha ask us to perceive it? Well, good news, Sut. There is actually another sutta from Venerable Sāriputta specifically about that topic. Majjhima Nikaya number 28 on the elephant's footprint. And Venerable Sāriputta also teaches dependent origination. And he says, if you're experiencing pleasure or pain, you should reflect, this is arisen dependent on contact. It's arisen dependent on contact. So you should reflect exactly as this sutta is saying. Let's say someone is yelling at you. You should reflect. This is a painful sensation arisen dependent on my ears hearing something. But my ears, for example, are non-self. My ears are made up of external elements. My ears I don't control them. They're part of nature. So it's just a process, an impersonal process, right? It's not I am hearing, but rather my ears are meeting a sound, and together they're producing an experience which is painful. So it's an impersonal thing. It's like if you flip the light switch, the lights come on. You didn't make them come on, with your psychic powers or something. It's, when you flip the switch, the lights will come on because of cause and effect, if the switch is hooked up properly. So if your ears are working and someone yells, you're going to hear, but it's not you hearing. It's just causes and conditions coming together. So that's how the Sāriputta recommended that you reflect. And also in this sutta, I would say he's also pointing to that. So we reflect. Whenever we experience pleasure or pain, we reflect, this is arisen dependent on contact, right? Contact is dependent on my senses, and so on. And then, okay, so now I'm going to move on to the sutta. And then we'll get to the other questions later on. Okay, so the Buddha heard this. So Ananda summarized this conversation to the Buddha. And the Buddha said, sadhu, sadhu, Ananda. He said, sadhu, sadhu. Good, good, Ananda. It's just as Sāriputta has so rightly explained it. Yathatan Sāriputta sama vyakramano vyakraya. So he says, it's just like Sāriputta has said it. Sāriputta has said it very well. And the Buddha says, I have said that pleasure and pain are dependently originated. So Sāriputta said, the Buddha said this, and the Buddha says, I have said that, right? It's not like the other times when the Buddha says, I have not said that, and you misrepresented me. So he's saying, yes, that is what he said. He says, I have said that. They are dependently originated. Dependent on what? Dependent on contact. Saying this, you would repeat what I have said and not misrepresent me with an untruth. You would explain in line with my teaching, says the Buddha, and there would be no legitimate grounds for rebuttal and criticism. So if someone asks you, that's what you can answer. Consider the ascetics and Brahmins who teach the efficacy of deeds. In the case of those who declare that pleasure and pain are made by oneself, all the way up to randomly, that is conditioned by contact. So whatever you say, however the experience seems to you, it's conditioned by contact, including your theory about it. In the case of those who declare that pleasure and pain are made by oneself, it's impossible. It's not possible that they will experience that without contact. So, netantanang vijjati means it's not possible. So, for example, this can be relevant when, again, like let's say you're experiencing, say someone is abusing you, you hear unpleasant words, right? Unpleasant sensation. And you might think, well, I'm hearing this, and so on. The Buddha is saying it's not possible for you to think in that, the self-centered way, like I, without contact. Imagine that you had no experiences. Like when someone is knocked unconscious, do they think I am hearing this? No, they don't. They can't. It's not possible. You have to be conscious. You can only be conscious if you have functioning sense organs which are contacting the world, which is an impersonal process. So where is the self? Where is it? Because when you're not conscious, it doesn't work. apparently. And when you are conscious, it's completely impersonal. So the Buddha is saying it's impossible, like whether it's from yourself or from a God, like an external being, it's not possible without contact. So this is pointing to a deeper truth. So dependent origination, I should say here, because I haven't mentioned it yet. Dependent origination is often taught as the middle way between either 2 or 4 extremes. So here you see the 4 extremes, like self, other, both, or neither. There are also other places where the Buddha teaches dependent origination just between 2, like between self and other, right? Without the elaborate side theories. And then there's also other places where he teaches it between 2 extremes. Like, for example, one time someone asks him, is everything a oneness? Is everything one? And the Buddha says he doesn't teach that. And they say, is everything then many? Like there's many different things. And the Buddha says he does not teach that. So you can say, like, are we all one or are we all different people? And the Buddha says he doesn't say either of those. He teaches dependent origination. So dependent origination is often taught as the middle way between a dichotomy, specifically a dichotomy about a self. So dependent origination, you'll see it again and again and again. It's always taught within the context of non-self. So they go together. Like dependent origination is the Buddha's teaching on non-self. It's his elaborate explanation. Like when people ask what gets reborn if there's no self, that is asked and answered with dependent origination by the Buddha. Here, is it myself? Is it some other being, i.e. another self, like an external self? And the Buddha is answering with dependent origination. So the idea here is that sayankatang, made by oneself, parankatang, made by another, or a mixture of the two, it's implying that there's a self. And then random is implying that there's no conditionality. There's no causes and conditions. The Buddha's teaching, there is a conditional relationship, but it's not about a self. It's not about a being in the sense that we think about it. So if you think about a theory of God, well, that requires a self. Like God is to the universe what the soul is to a body. So God is just the idea of a soul projected on an external thing. So that is what God is. That's why Buddhism denies the idea of a kind of eternal creator God. It's a view of an eternal, independent and unified self, which is outside of yourself, but somehow operates in terms of cause and effect, right? So there's actually a deeper problem with these views, which we haven't touched on, and I'm not sure we will tonight, but just to kind of scratch the surface of it, is that the Buddha, what he's really pointing to here is that it's not possible to experience pleasure and pain if there was a self, or if there was an external self, like a God. It wouldn't be possible. Okay, it's not possible, because if something is really unconditioned, right, which a self would have to be yourself, throughout change, like you're changing, you're getting older, your body's changing, your mind and your thoughts are changing. So those all go away. So if you are remaining the same, there has to be something which is not affected by those causes and conditions, right? In order to be yourself, it has to remain the same through time. So otherwise it's not yourself. It's just some temporary experience. So in order to be yourself, it has to be unconditioned, right? That's the only way for something to be permanent, is if it's unconditioned. Because if it's conditioned, that means under certain conditions it will arise, and when those go away, it will cease, which means it's impermanent. So if something is impermanent, it must be conditioned. If something is permanent, it must be unconditioned. If something is conditioned, it must be impermanent. If something is unconditioned, it must be permanent. So they go together. Change is just a way of talking about cause and effect. And cause and effect is just a way of talking about change. But I don't know if we have time to go into it, but I hope that is at least a little bit clear, right? So like when something changes, it can only change when the conditions around it allow it to change. Otherwise it would remain the same forever, right? So for something to change, something else has to change, which causes the change. And so when we talk about cause and effect, we're just observing change and we're trying to explain it. Right? Like someone gets older, we see a change in the body. So we try to explain it. Like, oh, it's because of this and this and this. That's why that changed. And so they go together. For something to change, there has to be a cause. And in order for there to be a cause, there has to be change. Otherwise, it wouldn't really be causing anything, right? So they go together. So what does that mean? That means that the idea that, for example, the universe was created by an unchanging God is impossible. It's not possible. That means the idea that a self or a soul makes choices but doesn't change is impossible. The idea that a self or an internal self, internal being which is unchanged, experiences pleasure and pain, it's not possible. The idea that an unchanging God, cares and loves for beings, it's not possible. So that's what the Buddha is kind of saying here on a deeper level, is that it's not possible for really any kind of consistent, unchanging thing to interact with other things, right? By definition. If it's unconditioned, it doesn't interact. If it doesn't interact, it can't cause anything, and it can't experience any results of causes and conditions. So that has dire, consequences. Like, for example, the lack of an unchanging, independent soul and the lack of a creator God. So it may seem kind of abstract, but actually it has very profound consequences, which are, you could say, devastating to many, religions. So obviously that would also apply to both. So if you say like, well, maybe it's both, well, that would just be double wrong, right? Because it can't be made by yourself, can't be made by another, so it definitely can't be made by both of them. So for example, the Christian view, like I mentioned earlier, of like God has free will, humans have free will, but they're independent selves, doesn't work, right? It doesn't work. So both have to be conditioned. And maybe before moving on from this, one reflection that I would give to you for this that you can think about, which may be helpful, is, for example, in the idea of a creator God, right? So people who believe in a creator God, they believe that maybe God is unconditioned, right? That is, God is not permanent, like I said, if he's conditioned. So if God is permanent, he must be unconditioned. And Christians would agree with that. They know that. So Christian theologians, they would also agree with that. Yeah, God, if he's going to be permanent, he can't be conditioned. So that's not, a Buddhist view. What the Buddha does is he just makes it more radical. And he says, well, then that means X, Y, Z. And he gives you a way to observe it in your meditation, most importantly. So what does that mean then, right? What does that mean? Well, that means that, for example, if God is unconditioned, then, like I said, he can't make any choices. He can't create the world. Because in order to create the world, he would have to make something change, which would mean that he would have to change, right? So at one time, he wasn't creating the world. And in another moment, he decided to create it. So what changed, right? In order for the world to have a beginning, there has to be a change that caused it, right? So that change, if God is the only thing that exists, it has to come from God, which means that God had to change, which means that God is dependently originated. So God is not permanent, which means that God is not self-existent. So God can't create the world. Now, let's say you say, well, God doesn't create the world. He just supports its existence, which some people also say. Well, in that case, he can't be supporting its existence. He can't have a relationship with the world. Otherwise, he would be dependent with the world, right? The world would be relating to him. If the world's relating to him, then causes and conditions are relating to it. So anyway, you can kind of go down this whole trail. Like if you can just follow the trail and you'll realize, you can start with just logic if you want to. You can just realize that, yeah, all these things, they don't actually make any sense. They seem, you can go your whole life believing that. You can go your whole life believing, yeah, God's permanent, God's unconditioned, and he created the world. It just takes a few moments of reflection. It doesn't make sense. It's not possible, right? God had to change for that to be possible. And then you can just do the same with your soul, right? If your soul is some kind of independent, unchanging agent with free will that can make choices, but it's unaffected by its surrounding environment, which is, again, one of the Christian doctrines, like the idea that, humans have free will, that ultimately their choices are unconditioned. Well, if ultimately our choices are unconditioned, we couldn't make any choices, right? Our soul wouldn't be able to make choices because it wouldn't be able to cause anything. It wouldn't be able to change. It has to change in order to make a choice, because a choice is a change within the mind, right? So what caused the choice to come about within the mind? Well, there had to be a change before that. What caused that? So you can just go back forever. So that's why the Buddha says the universe has no discoverable beginning. You can't find like a beginning point. You also can't find, kind of infinite regression, you just can't find any beginning at all. You're always going to find dependent things. So this is what the Buddha is saying here. So whenever there's a theory of a soul or a god or anything, a combination, those don't make sense. They're dependent on contact, which is dependent. Contact is dependent. Like, for example, the thought to make a choice. Well, that's dependently originate. But that also is not random. That's why he's also denying the aditya samuppanna option. He's saying it's not random. It's not, it is dependently originated. It is due to causes and conditions. It's just specific ones which aren't related to a god or a soul, and so on. Okay. So the Buddha just repeats that. He agrees with that. So that's the core teaching. Then he goes on and he gives even more explanation. So I hope you're not tired. So he goes on and he gives even more. Why does he do this? The Buddha is now going to give another angle on pleasure and pain, right? Because you might be feeling a little bit lacking here. Like, well, okay, so it's, pleasure and pain are due to contact. But what about karma? Like, I thought that our choices did actually have, results, right? And the Buddha does agree with that. So he's now going to explain how the intention aspect relates to these things. Because so far we've been more talking about the passive side, like the receiving end, the contact end, like who distributes the results of your karma. The point is that it arises dependent on contact. But now he's going to go a little bit more into like, okay, is it my soul creating it? Is it God creating it? Like, where is it coming from, right? So now he's going to give the active aspect of this. Okay. He says, Ananda, as long as there's a body, so as long as the body exists, the intention that gives rise to bodily action causes pleasure and pain to arise in oneself. Okay, so we'll break this down, and then the other ones will make sense. So he's saying, if you have a body, then the bodily, like your intention to move your body, for example, that gives rise to pleasure and pain to arise. It says here in oneself, but I think that that's an unfortunate translation, because he just said that oneself doesn't work, and the Pali is different. So the word oneself has translated two completely separate words. So I hope that's not confusing. So here he's saying adhyattam. Adhyattam means internal. Before he was saying sayankata, which means made by oneself. So it arises internally, he's saying. Means like, it's internal. So it's not an external event, it's an internal event. So it's not wrong, but it's confusing if you translate it the same way, because he's making a distinction, you could say. So he says that when we have a body, when you have intentions, like the intention to give things, right, give gifts, the intention to do bad things with your body, well, that causes pleasure and pain to arise. So that's the part where karma comes in. Your bodily intentions cause pleasure and pain. So if you have intentions which are wholesome, that intention is a condition for pleasure and pain to arise in the future, internally. Then he says, as long as there's a voice, the intention that gives rise to verbal action causes pleasure and pain to arise internally. So if you have a voice, whenever you're speaking, right, your intention is to speak. If it's a good intention, like nice words and so on, truthful words, or if it's a bad intention, false, cruel words, it's going to cause pleasure or pain to arise internally. And he says, as long as there's a mind, so if someone has a mind, if there is a mind present, the intention that gives rise to mental action causes pleasure and pain to arise in oneself. So, for example, if you have a mind, right, you're going to be thinking, right? The mind is going to be doing something. If it's doing a good thing, then it's going to be a condition for future pleasure. If it's doing a bad thing, it's going to be a condition for future pain, right? So thinking greedy, hateful thoughts versus thinking generous and kind thoughts, for example. Also, apart from thoughts, just the way that you focus your mind. Okay. So he says, but these only apply when conditioned by ignorance. Avidya patayata. Okay. So I won't explain that now. I'm going to move on, and then I'll talk about it later. So then the Buddha gives more explanation. Now he says, let me see here. Okay. By oneself, one instigates the choice that gives rise to bodily, verbal, and mental action, conditioned by which that pleasure and pain arise in oneself. So, then he goes on. or else others instigate the choice. One consciously instigates the choice, or one makes a choice in full awareness, or else one unconsciously instigates the choice. So one makes a choice or an intention without full awareness. Okay, these are the 4 options. It's heavily abbreviated, so that's why I went through it quickly. It's abbreviated in the text here. So what the Buddha is saying, he's just explained how our intentions give rise to pleasure and pain, right? Based off what our intentions by body, speech, and mind give rise to pleasure and pain. Now he's giving even more explanation of those different types of intentions. So it can be instigated like by oneself, so internally, the word is samang, or it can be instigated externally, pare. So this is, for example, let's say that you, you have something and you think, oh, I really should give this to someone else. So then you give it to someone else. So that arose, it was an internal thing, right? It was instigated by yourself, right? Speaking in a normal way, we'd say you decided to do that, right? Maybe you have something and then your mom or your dad says, you should give that to your friends, you should share and you should be generous. And you say, oh, fine. And then you give it to someone else. So see, that was instigated externally. Like there were external conditions that came together for that to happen. So you can kind of distinguish those 2 types of intentions. One is, you could say, arisen just from your own kind of thought patterns. And the other is arisen with external conditions kind of pushing you and nudging you that way. So again, maybe, for example, someone decides to say, make fun of someone else, bully someone. And then someone else, they bully people because all their friends are doing it. And so they feel pressure to do it because of their friends. So you see, the intention is actually a little bit different. Like they're both doing the same choice. They're making what's here called sankhara, so an intentional bodily action, bodily intention. They're making that sankhara, that bodily choice or intention or volition, instigated by a bunch of other people. Like it's kind of pressured on them. So you can distinguish these 2 things. So sometimes our choices are more internally generated and sometimes they're generated by something else. And then the Buddha also says you can make a choice sampajano. Sampajano means with full awareness. So this comes up, for example, with a lie. So the Buddha says a lie which is done sampajano in full awareness means like you know exactly what you're doing. You're saying something that you know is wrong. You know it's a lie, and you're saying it knowing that you're deceiving people. You know exactly what you're doing. And then there's other times, asampajano. Maybe you actually don't know it's wrong. You don't know, but you say the wrong thing. Or maybe you accidentally, you move your arm and you accidentally kill a bug, but it wasn't intentional. It was intentional to move your arm, but it was kind of not in full awareness. You weren't fully aware of what you were doing at the time. Or maybe you're very sleepy. So you do something like, talking in your sleep. So you're not really fully aware, but you are making verbal intentions, right? You're moving your mouth, you're making verbal intentions. And so the Buddha is just analyzing in more detail how we can think about karma from the perspective of our intentions. It can be internally instigated, externally instigated, full awareness, or not full awareness. Now, what we say in the tradition is that the best type of good action is internally instigated and in full awareness, right? So let's say that you have a gift. Internally, you just decide of your own accord that you want to give it, and you do it fully knowing exactly what you're doing. That's the best, right? If someone else pressures you and you know exactly what you're doing, it's still good, but it's not as good as if you did it of your own accord, right? It's not as powerful because you're being pressured. So you can look at this list as, apart from just like an abstract list of a bunch of different things, you can look at it as like whenever you're doing an action, you want to make it the best possible one. So the Buddha is saying that these are different types of intentions. So when you're doing a good thing, try to do it, quickly, willingly, of your own accord, and in full awareness. And when you're doing bad, you don't want to do it, of your own accord in full awareness, right? So you don't want to be, deciding, fully aware of what you're doing, deciding to do all kinds of wrong things. You don't want to do that. So obviously you don't want to do any bad things, but you can kind of see like, okay, I should try to my best extent, try to remove my fully aware self-instigated choices. That would be remove those bad ones and then start refining it. Also the ones that you're less aware of, and also the ones pressured by others and so on. So sometimes people are like, I want to be honest, but I feel pressured, right? Well, okay, the desire to be honest is good. It's good that you're not just being dishonest of your own accord, but now try to perfect your honesty, right? Perfect your truth holding. So you can look at these 4 intentions in this way. And so the word here, to say again, the word here is kaya sankhara, vati sankhara, and mano sankhara. So the Buddha is saying that depending on your sankharas, your intentions, volitions, choices, the word before, which is synonymous, is sanchetana. So chetana means intention. Sanchetana and sankhara are here synonymous. Are those cause pleasure and pain to arise, right? So basically what? Our volitions, our choices, they give rise to future pleasure and pain, right? By body, speech, and mind, instigated by oneself, instigated by another, in full awareness or not in full awareness. Then the Buddha says, however, as before, imesu ananda dhammesu avidya anupatita. Ignorance is included in all these things, right? So he says, all these are avidya paccaya. All these are included in ignorance. And he says, but when ignorance fades away and ceases with nothing left over. So what is this talking about? If you know the list of dependent origination, you know where does sankhara, synonymous with sanchetana, and together here used in the same context, where does sankhara, what is it conditioned by? It's conditioned by ignorance, right? Avidya paccaya sankhara. So, and what types of sankhara are there? There's 3 types: bodily, verbal, and mental, right? So here the Buddha has just explained that in a lot of detail. Remember, this is in the chapter on dependent origination. So he said there's bodily actions, bodily intentions, which cause pleasure and pain. There's verbal intentions, and there's mental intentions conditioned by ignorance. And then he says even further, there's bodily sankharas, verbal sankharas, mental sankharas, which are internal, instigated by oneself, by another, full awareness or not full awareness. And all those are dependent on ignorance, and they cause pleasure and pain. So what does that mean? When ignorance fades away. So if someone attains arhatship, if someone attains full awakening, if they fully understand the Four Noble Truths, they let go of, they fully understand suffering, meaning, in this context, fully understand dukkha. It means all 5 aggregate, their whole life. They fully understand it as all impermanent, as all, not to be grasped and not to be relied on, as non-self and empty and so on. So they understand all of existence. They let go of all their craving and clinging and attachment and defilements. They realize the cessation of their defilements, and they realize the cessation of the cycle of rebirth for themselves. And then they also they fully develop the practice that led there. So they fully develop the Eightfold Path that led all the way there. When they get all those factors, which they will come, when they come together for them, then their ignorance will cease. They'll see clearly. When they see clearly, the Buddha says, there is no body and no voice and no mind conditioned by which that pleasure and pain arise in oneself. There is no field, no ground, no scope, no basis conditioned by which that pleasure and pain arise internally in them. So what that means is can be slightly confusing, because you think, wait a minute, so they had ignorance and now they don't have a body or a mind, but they're actually, the Buddha was speaking this, supposedly the Buddha was speaking this, right? And he didn't have any ignorance. So how is that possible, right? How is the Buddha speaking this sutta if he had no ignorance, and yet he has no mind, no body, no voice, and no mind? Well, in this context, it's important to remember that body, speech, and mind, they don't refer to senses, right? So they're not, the body, speech, and mind, when they come together as a set, they're not talking about senses. They're talking about doors of action. So that's why the Buddha is saying that the intentions that he's talking about here, they arise with ignorance. So they're doors of intentional action. So arahants, people who have no ignorance, they still have senses, but they don't have body, speech, and mind in the sense of grounds, fields, scopes, bases of creating karma, right? They don't have the body, speech, and mind that creates karma. So body, speech, and mind, not like they don't have a body, not they don't have a voice. They don't have body, speech, and mind as gateways of action, doors of action based on ignorance, which create suffering in the future, right? That's the point. So it doesn't mean that, the Buddha can't speak anymore. It just means that his voice doesn't create intentions conditioned upon which upajitya jatang sukadukang, arise pleasure and pain internally. He's not creating any more future vipaka, any more future results, any more future pleasure and pain, dependent on ignorance through his body, speech, or mind. And so that is the end of this teaching. And so the Buddha has gone through, the Buddha and Sāriputta have gone through two aspects of karma. There's the passive side, our contact, right? How our karma, it ripens based off our contact, based off having senses, and it's produced based off our intentions by body, speech, and mind when there is ignorance. When we don't understand the world, so we react to the world with greed, hate, and delusion. When we still have attachment to the world, so we fixate and attach to our actions, and we cycle in accordance with those actions. When we don't realize the cessation of our defilements and rebirth, so we continue on thinking that the world is where happiness is to be found, that we are to find happiness by producing, by doing, by acting. So, and then the path, we haven't developed the path, then we don't understand this. So to end on a practical note, with meditation, on the passive side of this, we can start to develop equanimity towards the fruits of our karma, right? We can start to observe contact, observe how experience arises impersonally, dependent on our senses. It's not to be grasped after, right? It's impersonal. And then on the active side, we can recollect, okay, this is not to be reacted to with greed, hatred, and delusion. Why do we act? Why do we react to pleasure and pain? We don't understand contact, so we take it personally, and then we react with anger or with greed or with confusion, and then we create more intentions, which will create more pleasure and pain. So it's like a cycle, right? We create more and more. So what we want to do is we want to see, okay, on the passive side, how can I be equanimous and let go of these senses and their impingement on them, the sensory experiences? And then also, how can I not react at the same time, right? How can I not react and create a more passive mind, a more, you could say, subtle mind, which lets go? So like in meditation, we stop thinking as much, right? We try to stop thinking as much. We stop moving our body around. We stop speaking. Why do we do that? So that we can start to see the subtle tendencies of the mind to react, either in full awareness, sometimes not in full awareness. You also see that in meditation. Your mind starts like subtly in ways that you weren't conscious of before, starts reacting and creating karma because it doesn't understand. It thinks that happiness is to be found by thinking, happiness is to be found by doing, happiness is to be found by reacting, but that's how we found happiness in the past, but that actually just creates a cycle of suffering. So now we try to train ourselves through meditation to find happiness by letting go of that intention, by calming and stilling the mind and not reacting to the pleasure and pain that arises depending on contact. So that is the basic teaching here. And you can start to, like I said, go through subtle levels of subtlety. So at first we start to try to still our mind on the conscious level. Then we try to still our mind on the unconscious level, like the not fully aware level, like the mind moving around even when we're not trying to move it around. It will do that, right? And so we train ourselves with these two sides of the coin, the passive, the results of karma, and the active, the creation of karma with our intentions. And we try to balance them out, and they actually go together. That's where all the Four Noble Truths kind of come together. Contact is the truth of suffering. It's to be understood. Intentions, reactions are the truth of the origin of suffering. They create more pleasure and pain. They create more rebirth, more suffering, more results. So we want to kind of bring these together, understand the contact, and try to let go of the coarse reactions dependent on ignorance, right? Okay, so this time we can close with 3 sadhus, and then we can look if there's any questions. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And I am, not because of ignorance, but because of my mundane physical condition, I'm starting to have a coarse throat. So unfortunately, I haven't ended the basis for verbal karma, but I'm starting to lose my voice just by sheer physical conditions. So let's see here. Try my best to answer these. Hopefully that was clear to everyone. Just real brief, Bry says, are people allowed to attend monk chat in person? Generally speaking, we reserve it for residents just because of it can be chaotic with people arriving and going. But if you're here at 5 and you stay for puja, then you can stay for monk chat. Usually that's okay. Yeah. Okay. And then Manny asks, can Vipassana meditation keep the roots healthy? I assume by roots, you're talking about the roots of greed, hatred, and illusion, not of your garden flowers or something. So can Vipassana meditation keep the roots healthy? Yes, but so can Samatha meditation, so can all meditation, right? And as I hope was just clear from my explanation, the distinction between calming and Samatha meditation and Vipassana meditation, there really isn't one, right? Because what is the first noble truth is to be understood, and the second noble truth is to be let go of, but they go together, right? The Buddha was saying it's because of ignorance, not understanding, that you create intentions which create suffering. So the second noble truth comes from not understanding the first. So as you still your mind, you start to see better the contact. You can't see it if you're listening to music and yelling at your neighbor and watching movies and chasing around your kids. You can't see everything that's going on in your mind. And you also can't, so you need to still your mind. You need to stop doing all those things, right? That's the second noble truth. You need to slow down the craving. When you slow down the craving, you'll see clearer. If you see clearer, you will have less craving. When you have less craving, you will see clearer. When you see clearer, you will have less craving. So they go together. The Vipassana and the Samatha should be going together. They should be working together. Like sometimes people have this image of like Vipassana and Samatha are this couple who they hate each other and they wish they could get divorced, but they just can't because the Buddha put them together. But they're actually a happy couple. They work together. They go together. They don't want to be separated. So we don't need to separate them. So I say that because you asked about Vipassana meditation, but actually all meditation, if it's Buddhist meditation, it will help keep the roots healthy, not just Vipassana meditation. Okay, and then Hasanta says, is karma a sankhara? Yes, briefly speaking, yes. Karma is action. Sankhara is the intentions behind our actions. They come from the same root, kar or kar, which means to do. The only distinction is that the Buddha equates karma and sankhara because the Buddha says by karma, he means the intentional actions, the actions in terms of the intentions. But strictly speaking, karma is just an action in the language. But in Buddhism, karma and sankhara, they go together. Okay, Sud says, what about Nibbana? It is not independence upon anything. Isn't that permanent? I'm not sure this is really directly related to the talk. I mean, I know I talked about this briefly, but I don't think this is directly related, especially with only 3 minutes left. So, but I would just say that the Buddha defines Nibbana, I should say, the Buddha defines the asankata. He defines the unconditioned as the end of greed, hatred, and delusion. Because when you don't have greed, hatred, and delusion, you won't be dependent on anything. You won't be reacting or conditioned. Your mind will be conditioned by those things, right? So Nibbana is not being dependent because if you don't have any greed, hatred, and delusion, you won't be dependent on those things. You won't rely on them. That doesn't mean, that's how the Buddha defines it. I guess I'll stop right there. Okay, now Sud says, if one needs to focus on something permanent to contrast that in this world, that is, okay, if they want to focus on something permanent to contrast what is impermanent, does Buddha ever recommend meditation on Nibbana? Or would it just be a misperception since Nibbana can't be perceived in this world of the six sense bases? The Buddha does recommend meditation on Nibbana. It's called Vupasamanussati, recollection of stilling, recollection of settling down, like recollection of things coming to an end. But it's also true that unless you are a stream enterer or above, then meditating on Nibbana is not going to be particularly fruitful because you're just going to be meditating on your misconceptions about it. So I mean, it can be helpful, right? But it's important to recognize limitations. So you say, would it be a misperception because Nibbana can't be perceived in the world of the six senses? Well, the Buddha does recommend meditating on Nibbana, but it doesn't mean meditating on some other sense, like a seventh sense, right? It's not a seventh. So there is no seventh sense, right? There's just the sixth. And Nibbana is the Buddha says, the ending of suffering, the ending of, for example, he defines Nibbana in one place as salayatana nirodha, the cessation of the six senses. So in another place he says that you can only find the end of the world within this mind and body, right? The end of the world referring to Nibbana. So what that means is that Nibbana is not the six senses, but yet you don't need to meditate something like a seventh sense, right? It is just you can recollect the stilling of the senses. So if you want to meditate, you can just try like recollecting, for example, the impermanence of the senses, and you just recollect that impermanence. You recollect how all the senses settle, but you can find peace if you recollect. If you recollect properly, then you can find peace within impermanence. That's what the Buddha calls the happiness of the noble ones. He says that normal people, when when something that they like vanishes, they get sad. But he says that noble ones, when something that they like, when anything vanishes, they become happy because they reflect on impermanence. So that is a reflection on Nibbana. They're reflecting on Nibbana. They're reflecting on cessation. That's why it makes them happy. That's why the Buddha says that what other people consider suffering, the noble ones consider happiness. Because usually it's suffering when you lose everything, but Nibbana is losing, everything that you love, but you don't actually love it. That's why, it's peaceful. So if someone has attained it, so you can recollect in that way. But I don't know if it's going to be particularly fruitful if you might not find that peaceful. Okay. And then Lily says, if you don't mind, would you speak a little more slowly? I'd love to better absorb these profound teachings. Thank you, Lily. I will try to speak more slowly. Sadhu. Okay. And we have just from Hasanta, and then we will close up. The centrality of intentions to karma makes sense. I'm confused by Vinaya rule. If you intend to steal an... I don't think you're a monk, Hasanta, so I'm slightly confused here, but okay. If you intend to steal another's robes, but actually they were your robes, there's no expulsion. If they were someone else's robes, there is expulsion. I.e., shouldn't the only thing that matters be the intention, not the action itself? Okay. Mary says time's up. Yes. So briefly speaking, in terms of Vinaya, the Vinaya is not the Dharma, right? The Vinaya is a practical list of rules. So, like for example, in Vinaya, you're supposed to clean the bathroom. That doesn't mean if you don't clean the bathroom, you can't be an arahant. Of course, it's helpful. That's why it's in there. So it's related, but it's not 100% the same. So the Vinaya is a training for monastics to live in community together, not for attaining awakening. It helps attain awakening if you hold it the right way. It will obstruct awakening if you hold it the wrong way. So that's why, like, for example, the point of that rule is that, like, if someone actually steals, then it has, societal consequences. If they were just trying to steal, but they didn't actually steal, it has consequences in terms of karma, but it doesn't have societal consequences. So in terms of just living in harmony together as monastics, it's not as serious. The point is that thieves, like, people who the government would consider thieves, it would be a real disturbance for the monastics and for the society and for everyone. So the intention to steal is a problem from the perspective of the Dharma, but from the perspective of the Vinaya, what really matters most is, like, how can we maintain harmony? Because sometimes people might make a mistake, but maybe they can still be a monastic, right? So it's just saying that in the worst case of scenario, like, someone, if they really steal something, then they're expelled. If they tried to steal, they have a problem. Yes, they have a Dharma problem, a serious Dharma problem, but maybe they can still be redeemed because they didn't go to that level that would be really harmful on the level of society. So so when you're reading the Vinaya, please keep that in mind. Like, especially as a layperson, you have to keep in mind that the Vinaya is not a list of guidance for your practice. It's meant for monastics to live in harmony with themselves and with society. That's why it's not like Dharma advice directly. The Dharma is to be found through living it. Then you start to understand a little bit better how it applies to your practice. But otherwise, you might get the wrong ideas. Like, yeah. Okay, so at this time we can close. So we'll close with 3 more sadhus, and then we will say goodbye. So have a good night and a good practice, and we will see you here at the monastery or online for any future live streams. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.